Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today, we are going to be talking about how to make your mixes sound huge, and really how to make any element inside of your mix sound huge. You want huge sounding kick drums? You want huge sounding bass? You want huge sounding snare? You want huge sounding vocal? Huge sounding guitars? Whatever it is. Any aspect of your mix could sound huge or it could sound teeny tiny, itsy bitsy. How do we get huge? I'm going to give you some key insights into making things sound bigger without having a mix that sucks. Because it's possible to make something sound huge in your mix and have your mix not be any good. Like, that's totally possible. And that's something that you actually might sometimes encounter in the work of some beginning music producers and mixers. And I want to give you some strategies to make stuff sound huge when appropriate with the best possible results. Now, quick caveat, this is a podcast episode. It's a podcast. That means it's a talking format. If you want videos that have a bunch of audio examples and me walking you through the DAW, I've got tons of those. I'll link to a playlist on YouTube where you can see scores upon scores of those videos with me. I got years worth of them. We've also got the full-length courses where we go super deep, and you can hear me go through a bunch of different mixes or masters. Courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, which really gives you a whole roadmap and a system for mixing. You want to check that one out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. It will change the way that you mix forever, for the better. I personally guarantee it, or your money back. We've had literally thousands of students take this course, and the before and after results that I hear from people are just astounding. But even more importantly than that, it's the confidence they develop in mixing and the efficiency they develop in mixing, having their finishing rate go way up, having a clear path to get through each and every mix in so much less time than before with better results than ever before. If you want some of that, get it at mixingbreakthroughs.com, or if you want my full-length course on mastering where I teach you literally everything I know about mastering, the stuff I do day in and day out these days, you can get that at masteringdemystified.com, or check out the free videos that I'll link here. All right, last quick shout out before we get into the meat of today's episode is to our sponsors. It's a podcast, so it's got to have sponsors. If it wants to be a real podcast, smash the like button if you're on YouTube to get through this section even faster. Here we go. Okay, Sound Toys. Big thanks to those guys and making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. One of the most generous trial periods in the whole plugin business and some of the best tools in the plugin business. And practically all of our MixCon master classes with some of the best producers, engineers, mixers in the world. You'll see Sound Toys plugins all over them, and for good reason. Check them out and anything they make for free at soundtoys.com. Also, big shout out and thanks this month to Focusrite, sponsoring this podcast pretty frequently. Those guys at Focusrite make some of the best bang for the buck value in interfaces out there, from the entry-level Scarlett line, one of the best-selling series of interfaces in the history of interfaces. For good reason, it's hard to find better price to value and quality than you're going to find from Focusrite, all the way up to their high-end RedNet series. Check them out at Focusrite.com. All right, back on to today's topic of making things sound huge. I remember sitting in a college class on music production where we were listening to each other's productions, and this is one of the first times this idea of the real secret to making things sound huge came to light for me. And the secret, do you want me to give it away right now? It's contrast. You'll find contrast come up a bunch in this podcast because it's huge in music production, and it's huge for making your stuff sound huge. Topic of today. But contrast, let me just tell you the story that really made it sink home for me early on. And it's something that comes back to mind for me again and again. We were listening to like this rock production class that someone did really good, student rock production, really worked well. Pieces were tight. Everything was cool. And then after that, right after it, we listened to another production from someone else, really weird, different instrumentation. It was like I forget if it was a kick drum or an upright bass, but like really sparse, like one low-end instrument. There was a vocal and there was like a clarinet. And like it was practically, that was it. Maybe there was something else in there, but this is my sense memory. Like that was it. And each one of those elements sounded enormous. And one of the reasons for this was that there were so few elements in the mix that each one could be gigantic and not worry about stepping all over the other ones. And they were in such different ranges and such different parts of the frequency spectrum that each one could be gigantic, especially compared to this really dense rock mix with like 12 guitars in it and, 15 different mics on drums and like all the different vocals and guitar parts and bass that was going on. Like each element in that really dense rock mix had to be relatively small because there were so many of them. And in this really sparse, like acoustic-y mix, everything sounded huge and bigger than this rock track because there was so much space for everything. And that wasn't the only thing. We listened to the rock track and then we listened to this other more sparse acoustic track at the same level as that rock track. And that gave the impression of it being huge. Because when you have like a clarinet that sounds as loud as an entire rock band, that contrast makes that clarinet sound extra huge. So this brings me to one of the easiest, gimmickiest tricks for making your mix sound huge. You've probably heard this on a number of productions in the past. It is where your track starts off with like the band coming through like a radio effect, right? Like all the low ends cut off and all the top ends cut off. And it's just this tinny, thin thing with no real top end, no real bottom. And it's just all mid-range radio, like coming through a telephone or a laptop speaker. And then the whole band comes in and the band sounds huge. That's contrast. You can take a relatively unimpressive sounding mix, but put like a really crappy telephone radio filter version of that mix in front of it, then take the filter off and have the mix land. And all of a sudden that mix, even though it's not that impressive sounding by itself, sounds really impressive because you just heard it next to the tinny thing right before. So that gimmick, that trick, which has been used a ton of times in music production, works because of the contrast between lo-fi and hi-fi. And if you do it to like literally any track you're working on right now, it'll make the rest of the track sound huge. That's not always the aesthetic thing you want to do in the beginning, but people often do by accident the reverse of this in their mixes, especially when they're starting out. They can have an intro that sounds really big, and you have a big vocal and the big, like a big sounding keyboard or acoustic guitar. Whatever it is, just a few elements, and each one of them sounds really big. And then the whole arrangement lands, and the track kind of sounds small. It didn't get any bigger as it went along. It started off as big as it's ever going to get with a few huge elements, and then a whole bunch of other stuff gets layered on, and like it never ascends. The contrast went in the wrong direction. So, there's two big keys to making anything sound huge. Key number one is contrast. Things are only going to sound big, really big, if they're next to something really small. If you look at a team of basketball players on the court and they're all like 7'2" or something, they actually don't necessarily seem that tall. They seem like, normal people, I guess, kind of tall because they're in basketball. But then you put like someone who's 7'2" next to like an average sized, what's the average size in like America's like 5'9" or 5'9.5" or something. And you put those two people next to each other, all of a sudden the basketball player looks enormous. Because he is. But you need the reference of there's a normal sized person. Wow, basketball players are tall. But it doesn't necessarily come across quite to that magnitude unless you have the contrast of there's a normal sized person next to them. That really makes that as apparent as it could be. So that idea of contrast, number one, but it's not only contrast. It is also how much space there is in the mix. And generally speaking, the denser the mix, the more elements there are in it, the smaller everything has to be heard. You're going to have to make things tighter and brighter and leaner and smaller if you have 100 things in the mix compared to like if there's 3 elements in the mix. And this is something that you'll discover if you ever listen to a song like the kick drum is huge. It's often because they're letting the kick drum take up a lot of space because it's not competing with a ton of other stuff. The biggest kick drums you'll ever hear is like when there's a kick drum and a guitar and a vocal, and like that's it in one section. They can end up being enormous. The same thing with a vocal. A vocal can sound really big, really impressive when there's very little going on around it. And in particular, when the other things around it are a little smaller and daintier. That can accentuate how big the vocal feels. So those are some ideas there. Contrast being big secret number one, and the amount of space in the mix being secret number two. There's a little bit of an add-on to this secret number two, the idea of space. Space doesn't just work with the number of elements in a mix. It also works with the amount of space in between beats. How fast up-tempo or slow down-tempo a track is. The slower and more down-tempo a track is, the bigger sounds can be because the more sustain they can have at the end of a sound. And sounds that sustain more generally sound bigger, things that are more resonant, things that take up more space in time, as well as in the frequency spectrum, as well as in the level spectrum. That is something that makes things sound really big as well. If we were to add little additional things onto it, I guess you could say ambience can make things sound bigger potentially, because it's playing with that time dimension of stretching the sound out by adding reverb or by adding delay. So it's stretching the time out as well as potentially stretching it out frequency-wise as well. And there's also a balancing act across different genres that you want to be aware of. Like in rock and metal genres, there's often a balancing act between the hugeness of drums versus the hugeness of guitars. It's really hard to have a mix where both the drums sound huge and the guitars sound huge. It can happen, but generally speaking, as the drums get bigger and bigger and bigger, it makes the guitars feel smaller and smaller and smaller. And as the guitars get bigger and bigger and bigger, it's generally going to make the drums smaller and smaller and smaller. But that trade-off can be okay, because every once in a while, let's just talk about rock for a second. We can talk about other genres in a second, but every once in a while you could be listening to a rock song like, the guitars are massive. It's this huge guitar impact thing. And it's so cool that you don't even notice and don't even mind that they made the drums small to achieve that. And vice versa. I mean, there are some big sounding drum kits throughout rock history, but they usually sound huge because they're established at a certain point where the arrangement is really minimal and the drums sound way bigger than the guitars. And at some point in the arrangement, more guitars might come in, more instruments might come in, and the drums aren't quite as big in the rest of the mix as they were in the beginning, but because they were established as being so big early on, they give this the sense memory throughout of, oh, those were some big drums, so I guess everything else is big now too. So that's something that you can play around with. It's almost the inverse of what we talked about in the beginning, starting with a super lo-fi mix and then making it blossom into hi-fi. You can take really big sounding drum intro, and then when the whole band comes in, bring those drums down a little bit, make them smaller, and then bring everything else on top of those drums. So you don't get this thing where it sounds huge and then small. It sounds like huge drums, and then it sounds like huge band. And the way you get the band to feel huge is when the whole band kicks in, you bring the drums down a little bit. They don't have to be as big anymore. They impressed people. They had their shocking big intro, and then they tuck down to a level for the rest of the song where they're appropriate with everything, so the whole band together can feel as big as the drums were in the beginning. So you don't get that problem where things start off big, and then there's kind of a letdown where they don't get any bigger. And you do that by taking those big drums out in the beginning and bringing them down a little bit. And that's something to think about in general in production, that often the level that's going to work for a sparse section for a particular element is not going to be the level that works in the most dense sections. And that's why volume automation is such a crucial part of mixing. And while level, the damn faders in your damn DAW are one of the most important tools you have to mix with. It's the mixing part of mixing, the forgotten part of mixing, the most important part of mixing. Well, I could wax poetic for like another 20 minutes about all these examples about making things huge, but I want you to take these two core concepts, these two core secrets about how to make things sound bigger and apply them to your work right away, because that's where you're going to make big differences and big breakthroughs, is hearing these concepts in action in your own work and listening for these concepts in action in the work of some of your favorite producers and engineers and artists on some of your favorite tracks, some of your favorite reference mixes, some of your favorite commercial releases. Listen for this kind of stuff. The next time you're listening to a track and you're impressed by how big the vocals are, or by how big the kick drum is, by how big the bass is, how big the snare is, listen for what's small. Listen for what's going on that's allowing it to seem so big. Is there not a lot of other things competing with it? Is there some element, that bass sounds so big, but you really think about it and you say, that bass is so important and so crucial, I'm barely even hearing that kick drum, but it doesn't matter because this song in the low end is about the bass and they're letting that be huge. That's totally loud. A good mix doesn't necessarily mean you have to hear everything at the same volume at all times and you can hear everything clearly. A really great mix is not one where you can necessarily hear everything precisely. I'm going to say that again. A great mix is one that enhances the emotional impact of the song. And sometimes that means taking featured elements and really letting them be featured, sometimes to the detriment of other elements in the mix that aren't as important. It's your job as someone mixing, or your job in production, to steer the listener's attention to the most interesting and rewarding places in your particular production. And I hope that with this idea, these ideas from this podcast episode, you can start doing some more of that in your own work. If you want to go even deeper, we've got the full-length courses. You remember what they're called? Mixing Breakthroughs. Check it out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. We go super deep into the level setting, the panning, EQing, compression, reverb, how to apply delay, bus compression, how to actually hear compression. You got to check that out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Comes with a money-back guarantee. We've had thousands of students take this thing, and the feedback I get for it is overwhelmingly positive. I've personally heard before and after results from so many people who've been through this course. And it's not just what I hear, the dramatic improvements in their mixes, but also what they tell me about their confidence in their mixing, how that's increased, and their efficiency in their mixing, their finishing rate going way up, them finally feeling confident saying, I can call this one done faster than I ever had before because I have a plan of attack, a roadmap. You can figure all that out in Mixing Breakthroughs. Check it out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. I've also got the full-length course on mastering if you want to learn everything that I know about mastering, which is my bread and butter these days. You can check that out at masteringdemystified.com. Money back guarantee on that one as well. If you want some free stuff, we got tons of free videos, including demonstration videos with audio examples. I'll link to that here in the show notes and description for this podcast episode. We've also got free workshops for you, like the 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer. These are the 5 things that all of the best mixers out there today do on all of their best mixes. Well, some of them do only 4. Most of them do all 5. And chances are you're probably only doing 2 or 3 of these things. But if you start doing all 5 of them, your mixes are going to improve dramatically overnight without having to learn a whole bunch of new complicated techniques. Check that out over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits for the 5 habits of every great mixer. Also, you can check out our free workshop on Mastering 101 over at sonicscoop.com/Mastering 101 for your intro and primer to all things mastering. Big shout out and thanks to our sponsors on this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. They have been Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free over at soundtoys.com, where you can try out their awesome plugins, the whole Sound Toys 5 bundle for 30 days, with the most generous demo periods in the plugin business. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite, one of my favorite makers of interfaces. They've been making them for decades, and they have some of the best quality and some of the best pricing out there, really some of the best values and interfaces, from the entry-level Scarlett line all the way up to the high-end RedNet series. Try out anything they make over at Focusrite.com. All right, thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.